Schattle here as well. I know we've had some technical difficulties, so just wanted to make sure.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are.
Hello, thank you so much. Alrighty, so let's get started. As Dr. Schattle said, good morning, afternoon, and evening to friends and colleagues of the Soka Education Research Centre on Global Citizenship, or SERC-GC as some of us know it. My name is Ashna Niramathan, and I'm a first-year student at McMaster University's Master of Science in Physiotherapy program and a proud research assistant alumni of SERC-GC and the University of Guelph-Humber, Toronto, where SERC-GC is located. Once again, our annual special lecture has generated broad international interest with nearly 190 registrants representing 15 different countries. It is an honor to welcome Dr. Hans Schattle to give our annual special lecture this year. SERC-GC Director Dr. Paul Sherman will be introducing Dr. Schattle in a few moments. I know that many of you are familiar with SERC-GC, but for those of you who are not, I would like to briefly introduce the Research Center, as well as why this annual lecture is so special. SERC-GC provides the University of Guelph-Humber undergraduate students an opportunity to participate in scholarly activity that contributes to local and international discourse on issues related to Soka education and global citizenship. Its research has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals over the past few years as well. SERC-GC has been collaborating on virtual exchange projects with Kansai Soka High School in Japan and conducting research on nuclear disarmament education. 95 years ago, on this day, November 18th, 1930, two Japanese educators, Tsumbaro Makaguchi and his protege Jose Toda, published their first writings that outlined the system of Soka, meaning value creation. Makaguchi's ideas on reforming education were shunned within the Japanese education system. He strongly believed that the principal aim of education was to help each student reveal their inherent potential to create value or meaning in their lives, and through doing so, to become happy. He once wrote, "Other than happiness, there is no world that fully and accurately expresses the unhindered pursuit that is the objective of education." This rather unique perspective was not a popular position to take at a time when subservience to the emperor and support for the war effort were seen as the primary aims of education. Subsequently, in July 1942, both Makaguchi and Toda were arrested and imprisoned as thought criminals. Makaguchi died in prison at the age of 73, coincidentally, 81 years ago on November 18th, 1944. Toda was released from prison when the war ended and continued to envision the development of a Soka educational system until his death in 1958. This dream came to fruition in 1968 with the establishment of the Tokyo Soka Junior and Senior High Schools by Toda's protege Daisaku Ikeda, and then a few years later with the founding of Soka University in 1971. To date, there are schools in 8 countries that formally infuse their curriculum with value-creating pedagogy based on the shared vision and principles of Makaguchi, Toda, and Ikeda. The principal aim of Soka schools worldwide is to foster global citizens who can meaningfully contribute to society and to help strengthen the foundations of peace. So this time of year is very special for Soka education enthusiasts from all around the world, many of whom have joined us for today's lecture. I want to thank everyone for taking your precious time to attend this event to hear from our very special guest. And with that, I will ask Dr. Sherman to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashna, and thank you all for attending our annual special lecture. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Hans Schattle to deliver this year's lecture, joining a growing list of distinguished scholars and practitioners in the aligned fields of global citizenship and Soka education who have given the SERC-GC annual lecture at this significant time of year for Soka education. Dr. Schattle is a professor of political science at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. He works across the usual dividing lines in political science and international relations, with interests ranging from citizenship, democracy, and globalization to the politics of Europe, East Asia, and the United States. Professor Schattle has written two books, Globalization and Citizenship and The Practices of Global Citizenship, as well as numerous articles in academic journals. He earned his doctorate in politics at Oxford, and most recently he has co-edited the volume Making Social Democrats, Citizens, Mindsets, Realities. Professor Schattle presents research papers regularly at leading international academic conferences and often gives interviews to journalists around the world. Previously, he worked as a news reporter in his native New England, USA, before launching his academic career. I first became familiar with Dr. Schattle's scholarship during my early research into global citizenship, at which time I read his book, The Practices of Global Citizenship. This was a relatively unique study at a time of growing interest in the field of contemporary global citizenship education, in that he had interviewed nearly 200 individuals who, through various media sources, had expressed identification as global citizens or advocacy for the concept of global citizenship. To this date, it remains an impressive phenomenological study of first-hand accounts by self-identified global citizens that lends to a deeper understanding of the varied day-to-day practices of global citizenship. I particularly appreciate his categorization of the three primary concepts of global citizenship, namely awareness, responsibility, and participation. In my view, these three concepts suitably align with Daisaku Ikeda's three essential qualities of global citizens, which are wisdom, courage, and compassion. Awareness of self and others is comparable to the wisdom to perceive the interconnectedness of life. Responsibility matches up with the compassion to imagine the suffering of those beyond our most immediate contexts. And finally, participation as a global citizen requires the courage not to fear or deny difference, but rather to understand people of different cultures and to grow from our encounters with them. These parallel concepts all reflect what I consider the most significant and promising aspect of global citizenship, which, to paraphrase Dr. Schattle, points to global citizenship as not just a noun, but more importantly as a verb, a concept of action signifying globally conscious ways of thinking and living, and I would add, doing. Thank you for joining us for this special lecture, and now please welcome Professor Hans Schattle.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very kind and generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your invitation to join this group. What a great audience we have here. Thank you all for turning out for this event. And thank you to Ashna for setting the tone as well at the top of the hour. I realize we don't have a whole lot of time together. We usually don't run Zoom meetings anywhere longer than an hour. And today I also have a class to attend at the top of the next hour. So I'll try, I have quite a few slides to run through, but I'll try to limit my talk to maybe about 20, 25 minutes to open the door for as many of you as possible to share your thoughts or questions or comments. So if something occurs to you while I'm speaking, please feel free to write it down. I imagine you can use the chat function as well here on Zoom to make any comments or ask any questions, and I'll try to set aside as much space as I can for that. Right now, I'm going to try to share screens to put up my slides. I think Paul or Ashna, one of you might have to clear me to share the screen. There we go. And so I will put up my lecture slides here. And I should tell you, and hopefully you can see these. In a minute, you should be able to see the PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint slides now?
Yes, we can. Yes.
And can you, I hope you cannot see my lecture notes. Can you see only the slides and not my lecture notes? Could somebody just
Yes,
confirm that?
only the
Oh,
slides.
okay, I've also got my notes in front of me, but you don't need to see those. I'll try to keep it simple. So the talk that I'm about to give you, and maybe a little bit too briefly, will be the essence of a book chapter that I've just finished for the upcoming volume the Oxford University Press handbook in global citizenship education. It's being edited by Emiliano Bossio and Youssef Ouagid. You may have heard of these two scholars who have certainly been very visible in the field over the last 10 to 20 years. And I think that volume is slated for publication in about a year or two. So that's one upcoming book that you can check off on your list. Again, it's going to be published by Oxford University Press and have a whole collection of essays with a variety of perspectives on global citizenship education. And initially, when Emiliano came to me and asked me to write a chapter, he wanted me to pick up on what Paul had mentioned earlier, the three primary concepts of awareness, responsibility, and participation. But I thought about it, and I feel as if I've published enough on that over the years. You can find what I have to say about that online. So I suggested instead to the editors that I write on the problems that we're facing in the year 2025 and tried to confront directly the rising tide of, well, two rising tides, I guess. One would be, very hard line, hard right-wing versions of nationalism that emphasize closure and self-interests narrowly defined and short-term definitions of self-interest as well, rather than long-term common goals. And also going with that kind of far-right nationalism, or some call it populism, that we're seeing in many countries, many traditionally constitutional democracies these days, most notably the US. The other problem that we're dealing with is a lot of times far-right nationalism seems to go hand in hand with autocratic governance or authoritarianism. So I decided to center my chapter on that theme instead, and it's that theme that I'll focus on today. Just as a very quick baseline, I imagine a lot of you are already familiar with these points, but I just wanted to put everybody on the same page as to how I approach the idea of citizenship for starters. And I see citizenship in any context, at any scale or level, as having multiple streams of thinking and action as well. So one basic stream, and I'm also presuming that we're talking about citizenship in constitutional democracies here. One stream of citizenship is rights and responsibilities. Of course, even if you don't live in a democratic system, people, I think, still possess universal basic rights and responsibilities that go with them, but of course, they're most easily claimed and exercised in a democratic context. Another basic aspect of citizenship ties into how people situate themselves in political communities, the social and the psychological aspects of belonging and feeling a part of a political community, feeling senses of allegiance and loyalty to political communities, the individual's social, moral, and spiritual relationships with their political communities or their home bases. And then another aspect, highly participatory here is, in voice, the extent that citizens do their thing and raise their voices and try to have a say in decisions that are made, and try to really insist that governments give them a say, give us all a say in decisions that are made that affect our lives and affect the destinies of political communities. So I want to emphasize, as ever, that these basic elements or streams of citizenship can be applied both within individual countries and then beyond their limits as well. And then picking up from that, just a couple of definitions of global citizenship. And yeah, I want to emphasize there's no one particular definition of global citizenship, nor is there any one true path necessarily to global citizenship education. Instead, there are many approaches, many definitions, many different kinds of strategies as well that we can use in our classrooms and our campuses. And it's a question of figuring out which aspects of those definitions may be useful to us at any given time. But two definitions that I've liked and leaned heavily on over the years. One comes from political theorist Joshua Cohen in his introduction to the very famous volume of essays by philosopher Martha Nussbaum and then her critics on the idea of world citizenship. Cohen steps back at the introduction of that volume and talks about cosmopolitanism in general terms, which of course dates back to the to the ancients, particularly ancient Greece, the ancient city-states of ancient Greece, and people like Diogenes, who saw himself as an outsider, as a citizen of the universe rather than as a citizen of his village, or even Socrates, who emphasized allegiance to reason. Even many Stoic thinkers, as Nussbaum emphasizes in her essay, Stoics committed um, to universal ideals of obligation and duty and belonging to all. And Cohen encapsulates cosmopolitanism again through the lens of allegiance that I just mentioned, thinking about allegiance not just to a particular country, but placing the highest weight in thinking about allegiance on the community of humankind. That doesn't mean that one negates or denies or downplays your home country or your hometown or your family, but of course, we can mediate all these competing identities, and most of us in everyday life are going to put the interest of our families, I think, for one thing, above all else. But the idea that when we're thinking about political community in the collective sense, that the first principles of that should look at all members of that community, and the community should reach and maybe even start at the largest possible circle. And I think the debate that Nussbaum and her colleagues had in the 90s about that, around the time that the idea of global citizenship was beginning to gain a lot of momentum following the end of at least the end of the first phase of the Cold War, so to speak, with the US and the Soviets, and the rise of global interconnectedness, especially through communication and technological platforms, and of course, economic interdependence, that ultimately in an interdependent and interconnected world that we think about the community of humankind as taking priority in many respects, or at least being on an equal footing with our immediate political communities. And then I also like this definition from political theorist Luis Cabrera, who picks up the idea of rights and responsibilities and deploys it further. And in some ways, his definition may sound a little bit technical when he emphasizes a legal dimension, because I think for a lot of us, lacking world passports or lacking any kind of cohesive set of global governing institutions, for a lot of us, global citizenship may be more of a state of mind. Or as Paul said, in the way that I often frame it, is a verb, an action word about thinking and living and doing and so forth. Nevertheless, we can also think about global citizenship, even if rights and responsibilities are not necessarily codified by particular governments. We can think about rights as something that any human being, just by virtue of being alive, possesses, and then responsibilities that the rest of us all have to secure those rights and uphold those rights. And I realize that some can also criticize rights as Western constructs as well. But I will say what's been very striking to me in my now 18 years, I was going to say 17 years, but coming up on 18 years, based in East Asia, is how important the idea of rights have become, even in East Asian societies that often frame themselves around different bases for political community, whether it's Hong Kong or Taiwan or even in South Korea here, where we've had a lot of protests over the years to sustain a democratic government. Understandings of basic rights really do have universal implications, I think, and people may interpret rights differently in certain contexts. Some states or countries and place more emphasis on civil and political rights, and other places place more emphasis on social and economic rights. But rights cut across those areas. And for Cabrera, a global citizen is anyone, in his view, and he does have a more precise definition than I do. I tend to be very pluralistic with how I look at competing definitions. For Cabrera, the one true global citizen, I would say, in some respects, is a person who's working in one way or another to, as he says, protect the core rights of individuals who do not share their state citizenship. So
Mhm.
that
Right.
can mean either people living in one's country that are still struggling to be included and recognized as members or as residents in that community, helping immigrants of all kinds or refugees in your own country, or it can mean standing up for the rights of individuals outside your country. All right, now what are we up against when we think about global citizenship and the challenges that nationalism and authoritarianism or autocratic national leaders pose? I think there are three elements that we see in many different countries. And here I have in mind most notably the United States right now, my home country, which I'll talk about in just a moment even further. But we can also talk about, there's a larger phenomenon of democratic backsliding that political scientists have now been studying, unfortunately, for about 20 years. There was a lot of optimism around the same time that global citizenship was gaining momentum in the 90s and even in the first decade of this century. The idea that the century would bring about a more interconnected world and a world with increasingly coordinated global governing institutions that would seek to address common problems that no country could manage on their own. I'm thinking about books like Anne Florini's titled The Coming Democracy that argued that democracy would spread not across nation states, but internationally across an entire system as well. Well, what have we seen in the past 20 years or so? Starting from about 2006, actually, almost 20 years now, the leading indicators for the state or health of democracy in many countries have been showing gradual erosions, and in some cases, very dramatic and sudden erosions as well, erosions that may have been building up for some time in the society that then get legs and move when certain authoritarian leaders take over democratic political systems. We could talk about Hungary, the Philippines, Turkey, Brazil here and there, Poland, of course, Russia, which has slid, never really fully blossomed as a democracy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is now certainly an autocratic political system. And unfortunately now, from my point of view, the US as well, which has traditionally tried to position itself as the beacon of democracies globally. The first experiment, so to speak, in the late 1700s in a large scale, essentially democratic political community that in many ways was the standard bearer going into the 20th century and the 21st century. But we see three key dynamics in all of these countries that I've just mentioned. When you see authoritarian nationalists taking control, you see anti-democratic tendencies. Even if a leader will claim to be democratically responsive to the people, what you often find is that leader will be responsive only to his or her base, his or her narrow segment that elected that particular leader. And you'll find the leader will start, as I'll say in a moment, the leader will start to subvert or try to override the policies of other branches of government and consolidate power within the presidency or whatever other leadership position is titled. Usually it's a presidency itself. So authoritarian nationalism tends to be anti-democratic. I'd say it also tends to violate the constitutions of the countries in which these leaders are put in place. And authoritarian nationalism tends to be anti-humanitarian. It tends to drive very brutal wedges between the political community as it redefines itself by the authoritarian leader and then by the interest of humanity as a whole. So I'll focus especially here on the second Trump presidency because I think even more so than the first one. The second Trump presidency has really been a concerted effort in many ways to push, ramrod really through an authoritarian nationalist agenda that, Trump and his 4 years out of office and some of his supporters, many of the, I'd say, far right, even neo-Nazi supporters that gravitated toward him after the failed January 6th insurrection in which Trump tried to steal the 2020 presidential election. You have to remember, after that January 6th incident, which was really a horrible stain in many ways on the legacy of the US. And I personally, I'll just say this, I think it's very unfortunate that Trump was not impeached and removed from office by both houses of Congress right then and there, and also barred from running for the presidency again. And he should have been prosecuted and rendered ineligible to ever run for the presidency again. But so it goes, he got his second shot. And you have to remember that many of the people that were trying to work with Trump in his first term wouldn't go anywhere near him after January 6th. So the people that did go near him basically plotted this authoritarian takeover of the US government that we're now seeing here. And I'm not going, I could spend, of course, the rest of our time going through the bullet items on this slide as well as the next slide, but I just want to make it very clearly with all these bullet items. First, the magnitude, the scope of what Trump has done in less than a year in office so far. I'm not going to read these off one by one, but you can see in many ways, if you think again about what I said a moment ago, that authoritarian nationalism is anti-democratic, anti-constitutional, and anti-humanitarian. You can see it across all of these different bullet items. And this is what the US is up against now, trying to, those of us that are unhappy with this and frankly dismayed and aghast by this, this is what those of us who want to change the state of affairs in the US now are up against all these dynamics. We've seen most recently with the Trump presidency, basically blowing off the climate summit in Brazil as an indication of how Trump has abandoned climate policy. One that I want to really emphasize here is the abandonment as well of refugee policy. I think I have that. No, I don't have that on the next slide. I have that, I guess, on the first slide here. But the abandonment of refugee policy is really one of the areas of Trump. It hasn't necessarily gotten the most press, but it's just shocking to me that not only did Trump shut the door on over 10,000 refugees who had already been cleared for entry in the US, asylum seekers that were basically waiting outside the US to be entering the country at the time Trump had taken office. And granted, the clearance to not only go in the country, but they were pretty much going to be on track to secure refugee status once they got into the US. And Trump, first day in office, first week in office at least, issued executive orders not allowing them into the country. And since then, the Trump presidency has redefined its refugee policy that's going to actually not only refuse to admit most genuine refugees, people that are fleeing persecution in other parts of the world, but he's now he's basically taken the emphasis on persecution in the UN Refugee Convention, rewritten it in a way that he's going to apply it to favoring white nationalists that share his far right ideology, especially white South Africans, a small number of whom he let into the US already this year, kind of on a special track, that these people are going to be the ones cast now by the US as refugees rather than people that for the past 70 plus years since the Refugee Convention has been in place that have normally been seen as refugees. Imagine if every country abandoned refugees the same way that Trump's America is now abandoning refugees. What would happen? Who would look after the millions of people that are driven out of their homes that need other countries to cooperate and provide them security and shelter? So that's one problem. Plus the threats. I'm thinking about Trump's threat, and you can say, well, maybe he was joking, but his threat to denationalize Rosie O'Donnell, to expel her as a U.S. citizen, the very fact that he will play with things like that, or that Trump's State Department, which has basically canceled everything that previously U.S. State Departments would do to promote democracies around the world. And I don't want to say that the U.S. before Trump was perfect. It was far from that. But at least the State Department since World War II has been oriented toward the general promotion of democracy. Trump's State Department has written that all out. And instead, they have emphasized, and you can see this in the way that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, has worked, hand in glove with the so-called Department of Homeland Security in expelling the first people that they began to expel in a concerted effort this past year were university students who were in many cases who had committed no crimes and had simply spoken out on the conflict between Israel and Hamas and were defending the Palestinians. And that became grounds for expulsion from the US. And the State Department now has launched a Bureau of Remigration. That remigration basically means expelling immigrants that have come in, even legally, even immigrants who are in the country legally, and finding either incentives to convince them to leave on their own or ways to push them out if they don't. So I just cannot emphasize enough what a harsh, sudden, quick turn of events. I mean, Trump is a symptom of many currents in US political culture that have been simmering again for quite a long time. I'd say have been simmering especially since the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when the recovery to that in the US was very uneven and created a lot of discontent that led to Trump getting elected. But I want to say that this year and the events that we have seen and the way that Trump has dismantled the usual constitutional protections of all kinds and the usual separation of powers and the usual principles for which the US claims to advance, however imperfectly, it may seem very sudden, and it's designed, I think. They have specifically set this forward to make it overwhelming and hard to resist. Here's my second set of bullet points, which I really don't have time to get into, but you can screenshot it or I can share it with you after the lecture if you like. And we could certainly talk more about these problems in the Q&A. Certainly the attacks on universities would be a big part of this. And I think also the repurposing of the US military and also the Department of Justice is basically entities that are now going to act on the whims or the dictates or the social media posts of the president rather than actually trying to follow the rule of law. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, of course, is supposed to be an entity that works independently of the president's personal or political objectives, and that has completely been turned on its head. And also, I'll just briefly mention that, of course, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement entity which is, of course, now brutally and viciously taking many immigrants off the streets and even arresting many US citizens as well that are exercising their constitutional rights to protest the atrocities that ICE is doing. Most notably, a Baptist minister in Chicago, you might have seen the photos of his head being thrown to the ground last week that went viral on social media. I recommend you follow that story and you watch his sermon as well, where he talks about um, the struggles that the U.S. is facing, yet his optimism that the struggles for civil rights will prevail. I mean, ICE is also now being used increasingly as a kind of personal, extrajudicial, extra constitutional militia group, a paramilitary group that's at the disposal of the president rather than subservient to any kind of rule of law. So the problems in the US right now are massive and daunting, but they are there. And just a few conclusions here, and then I'll shift more to global citizenship education, and then we can go into conversation. One is that Trump 2.0 does accompany a broader context in world politics, a return, of great power rivalries. In some ways, a new Cold War. There are scholars that argue the old Cold War, unfortunately, with the Soviet Union, seems to have never ended, that we're still stuck with great power rivalries. And those that want to emphasize more global channels of governance, we still have obstacles in the form of great power rivalries to deal with. And not only that, but there's also a rise in state lawlessness now in foreign policy. That's Simon Tisdale's term. He used that term in a column in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago. And he was using it to apply to Trump with regard to the boat killings in the Caribbean. He was using it in the context of Russia's invasion and attacks on Ukraine, and also Israel's attacks, genocide really, on the Palestinians over the past couple of years as well. So all of what I've just described, unfortunately, is antithetical, not just to global citizenship, but to democratic citizenship of any kind, in any sphere. And it's also corrosive to the idea of the rule of law in any society. So those of us that are working in the field of global citizenship education now have to deal with that. And we have to figure out how in our courses, how in our programs on campuses, how we can help citizens regroup and stand up for themselves. And if we value the rule of law or democracy in any way, shape, or form, we have to figure out how to rebuild it and revive it. And not necessarily in the same way as it existed before, but in ways that will create a hopefully better and more resilient democracy and more inclusive and reasonable democracy than we may have had in the past. I mean, one of the hardest things about all of this, I could possibly leave you thinking after talking already much too long on this, how you might say, well, how in the world has Trump gotten away with this? Well, he got elected after all. And same goes for the various authoritarians in other countries as well. And there are many people in the US, and I know and have friendships with some of them that are, frankly, I heard this from an old college friend of mine. When I was telling an old college friend of mine the spring that I thought the US, early spring actually, I think it was after Rumeysa Ozturk was kidnapped from the streets near the Tufts University campus. You probably saw that video. And I said to an old college friend that I was worried that Trump was taking the US into a downward slide toward fascism. My old college friend said, no, I have my perspective is all wrong, and he's over the moon by what Trump is doing. And he thought that Trump was just right in a whole variety of areas. So there are people that support him. I'd say about it's dwindling because I think elements of his base, and this happened in Brazil as well with former President Bolsonaro. People decide to take a gamble on far-right authoritarians, but then they realize they're not any better off under them. And then many of them get turned off by the kind of vulgarity and cruelty and brazen corruption and abuses of power that go with them. So people do turn against far-right leaders, but the far-right leaders don't necessarily go quietly. as well, nor do they go peacefully. So that is another problem. All right. I've cursed the darkness longer than I planned here. Let me spend about at least 5 to 10 minutes just trying to present some general points on global citizenship education and the various tools that approaches to global citizenship education offer those of us that want to strengthen democracy and also just improve the overall goal of human flourishing as well for our students and help our students develop the kind of character that will help them thrive both as citizens and generally as human beings as they go forward in life. There are a lot of definitions of global citizenship education. I've put one here. This is a definition from the UN. And of course, through UNESCO, the UN does a lot to try to advance the idea of global citizenship education. And certainly, what I want to emphasize in this definition, and I'll kind of short circuit this as I go through my remaining slides, but a lot of what goes with global citizenship education in terms of empowerment and helping people take on an active voice to help our communities address challenges, again, as I said earlier, that no country can solve on their own, and I like this phrase here, become a proactive contributor to a more peaceful, tolerant, I would prefer the word respectful, but peaceful, tolerant, respectful, inclusive, and secure world. I mean, that mandate or that broad brush works across a whole variety of issues here, whether we're talking about the environment, public health, human rights, the well-being of women and children, non-binary people, whether we are talking about labor rights and labor standards or security in the face of threats such as nuclear proliferation, suicide, terrorism. You can take any issue that you want to address in your classes or your activities on campus and connect it to that larger principle. These slides I'm going to go through very quickly because I think a lot of you, if I'm assuming many of you are probably practitioners or scholars in educational studies already, you will know already that there are many different approaches to global citizenship education. The liberal and the neoliberal approaches in some ways emerged first. I mean, when we say liberal, we're talking really in the basic classic sense of liberalism, as in a free society, the basis, the philosophical basis for a free society that emphasizes individual human rights. And not only that, but also the dignity of the human person, the capacity of each human person. I'm thinking Immanuel Kant's view. Kant is not a perfect human being either, but the idea that, as Kant emphasized, that every individual has the capacity to reason their way through life, and the individuals and their reasoning abilities can be trusted to help political communities sort out their own decisions. Of course, this connects very much to the idea of political community as the consent of the governed, rather than as the top-down authority of a king or a ruler or emperor, whatever have you. So the liberal approach to global citizenship does have very basic affinities with constitutional democracy over the years, and I think Karen Pashby and her colleagues have written about this in the literature on global citizenship education. Over the years, in some ways, that basic liberal premise for global citizenship education has given way to a neoliberal view that tends to emphasize deregulation, privatization, unfettered trade, whatever the social hidden costs may be. Many universities have over the years, and even many grade schools too, high schools in particular, have placed global citizenship in a context that is mainly about helping graduates become globally competitive and globally competent, meaning that they'll be able to flourish in an interconnected marketplace, a marketplace where your competition may be in other countries, not in your home country. I mean, that's important. I don't want to downplay it, but I think many of us have recognized over the last 20 years that that's not enough. There needs to be more emphasis when there are power structures in place that kind of end up sorting the winners and losers in our societies, at least in economic terms, or structures or policies in place that have the effect of creating social harms or widening inequalities or leaving all kinds of workers dislocated when they lose their jobs. 30 years ago, that problem was workers losing manufacturing jobs that went overseas. Nowadays, it may be the professional workers that are losing jobs to AI. It's very hard now for our graduates to be finding jobs, even at an elite university here in South Korea like Yonsei, where generally students could easily coast to jobs in the big conglomerates and make all the money they wanted. Going to Yonsei was like a golden ticket in years past. Not anymore. Even students from the most illustrious universities now have a hard time landing. So, a lot of what we mean is critical global citizenship looks, and I'm oversimplifying here. There's plenty of literature on this that I can share with you, but it means looking at the existing systems we have in government and also the systems that drive the economy and looking at how they produce inequities and inequalities and what we can do to understand, first of all, to understand those inequalities or injustices or inequities, and then what can we collectively do in all kinds of communities? And it often starts with local action, frankly. How people can mobilize and raise voices and begin to question those inequities or injustices and begin to rectify them. And then I'll also emphasize ethical global citizenship as well, which is emphasis. And Emiliano Bossio and I tried to work this through in a paper that we published in Prospects a few years ago. But that's focusing again, and I think many of you, even Martha Nussbaum and her colleagues, did this years ago in their essays. Ethical means focusing on the character formation, holding political institutions and economic structures and so forth to critical scrutiny. It's connected to critical global citizenship, but also looking at the mindsets and capacities, and as de Tocqueville would have said, habits of the heart of individuals, the capabilities of individuals as well to go forward and try to advance better solutions, not only for the moment, but also with a larger intergenerational mindset as well. All right, just a couple of slides and then I'll try to open up to conversation. So, what are some growth opportunities? Or I could have framed this slide as well. What are the kinds of toolkits or imperatives that we can focus on? One is the idea of community-based global learning. I recommend the book by Eric Hartman and his colleagues on this theme. I could go into it in more detail if I had a lot of time. I'll just say briefly that many of us who have promoted international exchanges or international service learning have worried over the years about the problem that students and groups of people can parachute into a community and make it appear as if you're doing something for the community or you feel like you're doing some sort of service. But if external groups are just parachuting into communities that are often not that well off to begin with. And then those communities hosting the students are going through a lot of work and even expense and resources and sweat to host the visiting students and provide opportunities for the visiting students to improve their resumes by painting the walls of a school or building a house or volunteering, doing some sort of work. We have to keep in mind when we're initiating service learning activities that it's not doing something for other places, it's doing something with other places. And that many times the communities that are hosting scholars or students from fairly privileged places in the world, many times those communities are actually giving the visitors a lot more than they're receiving in return. That having reciprocity in relationships across borders is very important when thinking about community-based global learning. That applies in local context as well. So that's one principle that I'll just acknowledge, and there's a lot written on that that's important. One very practical, and I would say basically sustainable. I know there's a carbon footprint even in this Zoom meeting with all of us using the technology electronically to make it happen. But flying from place to place, of course, whether it's conferences or service trips or study abroad programs, there is a very big carbon footprint that goes with it. In an age where we really do have a climate crisis unfolding, virtual education is very important. And there's a lot of good that can be done with it. I've been doing online teaching collaborations, basically team teaching projects and joint student projects in my classes now for about 10 years. And I will say, COIL, by the way, means collaborative online learning. It became especially popular during the COVID-19, during the height of the COVID pandemic, when we were all teaching online, and educators were looking for ways to stay connected to their colleagues and keep their students connected to other parts of the world at a time when otherwise it might have seemed we were all too self-contained. I'm currently working on a paper where I want to emphasize the idea of maximalist COIL, maximizing the interactive approaches that this can bring. I would say just briefly, the most meaningful kinds of COIL partnerships are ones in which you have the students working as co-creators of knowledge and insight with their classmates in the other groups that they may be partnered with. I've worked with students, my classes worked with students in Los Angeles and in Chicago. For instance, last year, the students in my media and politics class worked with classmates at DePaul University in Chicago, and we looked at the presidential politics and the election cycles, both in the U.S. and South Korea, through the lenses of those two countries. So looking at the US election from a South Korean point of view and looking at South Korean politics through US point of view. Many times virtual education will be more transnational. You have a case study. You may look at things in big picture global terms, but you may also look at them from the vantage points of the countries or even the local communities where people are based. The other bullet points here, I've already talked a lot about democratic education, so I'll set that aside. But a lot of democratic education also goes with problem solving. Again, whether it's the problem of the climate crisis or public health or preventing the next pandemic or figuring out how best countries can live up to their responsibilities to serve the needs of refugees around the world. I think global citizenship education in some ways has done very well at emphasizing how human beings can see it as a mindset and as a way of thinking and living and so forth. But I think there can be more done in terms of how we might build institutions at all levels that can be both more democratically responsive and also globally far-sighted, engaged on solving those problems. So last bullet point here is I think we should focus increasingly on possibilities for democratic innovation. And I will say this, positively speaking, and again, it's just a gradual baby step forward, but at COP30 in Brazil this month, there was a global, what they call a Global Citizens Assembly working on the sidelines of that. Increasingly, in political science and more generally in international communication, there's a lot of activist groups. I'm thinking of the ISWE Foundation in Europe, which is funding this. I'm also thinking about the Democratic Odyssey Project in Europe. You have a lot of institutions now in some governments and also across civil society that are increasingly working on ways to create citizen assemblies based on random samples of the population or random snapshots, stratified random samples that are often adjusted to match the characteristics of the publics. Choosing people by lottery rather than by election to study the issues of the day and then come up with policy suggestions or recommendations. I mean, if we were to be ambitious about this, if we were imagining constitutional change in the US Senate, I might suggest that a redesigned US someday would have the House of Representatives pretty much the way it is now. But maybe the Senate, instead of being two for every state, maybe the Senate would be a citizens' assembly selected by lottery rather than a citizens' assembly that would be on the sidelines just making recommendations. We could possibly be ambitious. In Europe, the Democratic Odyssey Project right now is quite ambitious. They are proposing and advancing the idea of creating a citizens' assembly that would exist alongside the European Parliament. It might be decades before that happens. It took the European Parliament a long time to gain power and decision making in the European Union alongside the Council of Ministers, which for years was the primary legislative entity there. But the idea that we could have citizens' assemblies, not just making recommendations, but ultimately, having a binding institutional role where citizens, instead of running for office, would have the chance at being selected randomly to serve on an assembly. And you could take a leave, I mean, if I'm imagining this far-sighted, you'd be able to take a leave of absence from your job for a year or two to serve. And then you would become an expert during that learning process that would go with being on the assembly. And if you study the scholarship of Jim Fishkin, a political scientist at Stanford University, he's done a wonderful job for the past 30 years looking at how he calls it deliberative polling, but looking at how citizens' assemblies can come together and bring forth fairly enlightened ideas once the citizens take the time to hear each other's perspectives. And one really important finding from Fishkin that I want to emphasize, Fishkin and his colleagues, at a time of extreme polarization in our societies, we have Fishkin, and I shouldn't say we because I've not done the work. Fishkin and his colleagues have found that actually when you put people in deliberative settings and you find well-rounded ways to present all sides of an issue, not just two sides, but all sides, people generally lean toward more moderate compromises. I'm not saying that moderation is always the way to go in politics, but compromise is often essential in democratic politics, figuring out how the most essential areas on competing sides can be brought together for an imperfect but workable solution that political communities can live with. And there's a lot there. So I encourage you to look at citizen assemblies and even think about how to put them in place on your own campuses. Sometimes I will, and when I'm teaching, I'll give my students a chance to solve a problem or just think for themselves on even how to change, whether to make a change in the syllabus. I'll throw it to the students and have them deliberate in the class and let them try to walk the walk of being on a citizens assembly. So just some practical takeaways as well here that I'll end with. One is very important in adverse times to find the colleagues on our campuses that will support initiatives resembling global citizenship education to begin with. Second, to bolster the support of networks on our campuses that already exist with continued involvement in professional associations. They can be the lifelines that bring colleagues across borders together. Important to design programs in new ways while also building upon what already works on our campuses. Think about what works well on your campuses as a base before going forward with new programs. Build bridges between global citizenship education and researchers or student groups working toward policy changes on human rights or immigration or the environment or democratic reform in general, whatever issues matter to you. Encourage students to get out of their enclaves. It's sometimes not easy for students to do that, but we can try to set the stages in our classrooms for starters, for different voices to be heard. Again, sometimes easier said than done, but it's worth it to keep trying. And give students the space really to shape their own learning and to enjoy. This goes back to COIL and virtual exchanges as well, to have a chance to enjoy the opportunity to interact with other people who are quite different from them. So I'll just leave those final points on the slide as well, but I think I've covered them. Thank you all for your patience and your time listening. I realize I've only left about 5 minutes for responses. Maybe we should simply hear a few responses all put together, and then I really do have to leave as we approach the top of the hour. I apologize for that. But thank you all for taking time to listen, and I'll be very glad to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schattle, for this engaging and very, very insightful lecture. Just to agree with you, we do recognize that you do have to head to a class at 8 o'clock. So I was thinking that we may have time for maybe one question. If any of you guys have a question, please feel free to unmute your mic or you can type it in the chat and I am more than happy to read it out loud.
I do. I'd like to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for very much for this really interesting talk. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the concept of democratic socialism, because a lot of the things you said is really under that umbrella, but it seems to be like dirty words. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is if you've ever heard of Alex Neve. He's a Canadian former head of Amnesty International and a public speaker. And his talks are pretty much like yours, but from a little bit different perspective. So that's my question.
No, I haven't heard of Alex, but I'm delighted that you mentioned him, honey. So thank you for that. And I'll have to find out more about him and check him out. I
Yeah.
always make a point of telling my students, and especially lately with Zoran Mandami's electoral victory in the New York mayor's race, that for all, and Bernie Sanders would be in this category as well, of course, in the US. I think your question is somewhat specific to North America. I mean, Europeans, I don't think bat an eyelash at, they don't bat an eyelash at democratic socialism. For them, center-left political parties that in Europe are seen quite moderate and sensible and pragmatic and oriented toward the public, um, are just mainstream. And in the US, I mean, despite the label, what Mandami is proposing is an effort, I think, to try to redress a lot of inequalities and dislocations that go with everyday life in New York City. Why not tame the marketplace? I guess I'd say one very simple way of thinking about democratic socialism, or I don't frame it that way. I prefer to use the term social democracy because I think it sounds a whole lot more positive than democratic socialism. Democratic socialism in the US, because in the US you get so many people and even movements that conflate socialism with, Stalinism, with old-fashioned, Soviet Union totalitarianism. There's like this flawed mindset that socialism equals totalitarianism. And Americans, even though they should have been educated otherwise over the last 80 years, socialism does not mean totalitarianism. I mean, Social Security, the most popular social welfare benefit in the US, is democratic, actually. And what socialism or social democracy, whether you use that phrase, and what it's all about is taming the market, not getting rid of the market necessarily. I mean, I like nations of shopkeepers. I like being able to walk down a street and seeing all those little small businesses able to flourish and sell their merchandise. Think about bakeries and how, I think bakeries are a very good illustration of why capitalism, in many respects, works as a background for a society. But when capitalism leads to concentrations of power, then the government has to intervene and regulate to keep the playing field level and create incentives for innovation, for small businesses to make their way, and also provide social welfare benefits. So stopping monopoly power and promoting social welfare benefits for all and redressing inequalities and life chances. Socialism's probably the wrong label for that. I would prefer social democracy. And I'd like to think that Mandami and also Seattle has a new mayor that's going in this direction. John Meekham, I'll leave you with this sort of hopeful note because I spent a lot of time cursing the darkness again in this lecture. But one of my favorite points this whole year was historian John Meekham on The Daily Show doing a guest appearance. If you know The Daily Show, I think comedy central, I think late night satire overall this year has been important as a common public space for people to try to get at the depths and the absurdity and in some cases the evil of what's been happening this year and to try to imagine better alternatives. That's why Trump hates late night comedians so much this year, why he's trying to get several of them off the air is I think he knows that they're a threat to him. But John Meekham, who's not a particularly, I don't think Meekham is a socialist, by the way, not by any means. He might be a social democrat. He might find affinity with that. But John Meekham made the point that the more atrocious we see, and more excessively atrocious and flagrantly atrocious we see from the political right now in the US, or Trump in particular. I'm not even sure Trump fits within the right in many respects. There's a whole stream of moderate conservatism here as well that can be reconciled and can work out compromises with social democrats that we haven't even discussed. I mean, think about it, the NHS, Britain's universal health care is not something that any moderate conservative government in the UK has ever tried to abolish. It survived Margaret Thatcher, for heaven's sake. So social democrats and moderate conservatives can reach compromises. In many ways, what Trump has been doing is just off the chart into some sort of fascism. The US is hopefully not a fascist country, but it has a government right now that's operating out of a fascist playbook. And we just have to acknowledge that. But Meekham's point was that Trump seems to be overshooting this so much, even with his corruption as well on top of it all, that we may see, we always see in democracies pendulum swings. And normally we see pendulum swings, say, from social democrats to moderate conservatives. In Europe, they call Christian Democrats. But with Trump's swing this time being so wildly off the chart, Meekham thought the next swing may also be more sharp than usual. And for the US, a sharp swing rather than go with the Democratic Party that in many ways is kind of like the old Republican Party, moderate, but really not left of center in any way, shape, or form. And I know I'm not unpacking that, but Meekham thought maybe the next president we're going to see is President AOC. He put that right out there. And I'm not sure if AOC, if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will in fact be the next president, but I think that AOC and Bernie and Mandami and many other younger leaders that are emerging, people are beginning to step up. And there's increasing hope that this movement, even if it doesn't necessarily carry the day universally, that it will at least gain more currency. I'd love to see President AOC myself, honestly. But if I can't have that, at the very least, I want that movement to be setting the agenda, not only for the U.S. in-house, but also for the kind of role that the U.S. should be playing as a responsible stakeholder in an interconnected world. So I see other wonderful questions in the chat, and I hope that we can capture those questions and maybe circulate them afterward. I really have to run out the door now. I apologize. But I'd
Yes,
be glad to share the slides with you all if Paul and Ashna want to follow up afterward. And I'd be happy to see any of your other comments as well. I suppose you guys could continue the discussion for a few minutes even now if you like. You don't necessarily have to end the Zoom meeting. I'll leave it to your discretion, but I have a bunch of students waiting for me now. So I'm going to head out. Thank you all. And again, I really appreciate the questions and comments that are emerging. Take care, everybody.
thank you so much, Dr. Schattle. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you. Have a nice evening or day. Take care.
Alrighty. I know that a lot of you guys put some questions in the chat, and I do apologize that we didn't get a chance to get to them. However, as this meeting comes to an end, I would like to thank everybody who joined us today from both near and far for taking this time to be with us, and for your continued support of SERC-GC's mission. Your ongoing presence, interest, and support are truly what make this annual lecture such a special gathering each year, and it makes it something that we all look forward to. So, with that being said, this concludes the special lecture for this year.
Thank you, everybody. See you next year.